Make sure to subscribe our channel and press the bell icon to show us your support. You may pause the video at times to read the questions or the answers at your own pace. To the questions. Question 1. You have an Azure virtual machine that has a single data disk. You have been tasked with attaching this data disk to another Azure virtual machine. You need to make sure that your strategy allows for the virtual machines to be offline for the least amount of time possible. Which of the following is the action you should take first? Our options are A. Stop the virtual machine that includes the data disk. B. Stop the virtual machine that the data disk must be attached to. C. Detach the data disk. Or D. Delete the virtual machine that includes the data disk. The correct option is C. Detach the data disk. You can simply detach a data disk from one virtual machine and attach it to the other virtual machine without stopping either of the virtual machines. Question 2. Your company has an Azure subscription. You need to deploy a number of Azure virtual machines using Azure Resource Manager templates. You have been informed that the virtual machines will be included in a single availability set. You are required to make sure that the ARM template you configure allows for as many virtual machines as possible to remain accessible in the event of fabric failure or maintenance. Which of the following is the value that you should configure for the platform update domain count property? Our options are A. 10, B. 20, C. 30 or D. 40. The correct option is B. 20. Each virtual machine in your availability set is assigned an update domain and a fault domain by the underlying Azure platform. For a given availability set, 5 non-user configurable update domains are assigned by default to indicate groups of virtual machines and underlying physical hardware that can be rebooted at the same time. Question 3. Your company has virtual machines hosted in Microsoft Azure. The virtual machines are located in a single Azure virtual network named VNet1. The company has users that work remotely. The remote workers require access to the virtual machines on the VNet1. You need to provide access for the remote workers. What should you do? Our options are A. Configure a site-to-site VPN. B. Configure a VNet to VNet VPN. C. Configure a point-to-site VPN. D. Configure direct access on a Windows Server 2012 server virtual machine. Or E. Configure a multi-site VPN. The correct option is C. Configure a point-to-site VPN. A point-to-site VPN gateway connection lets you create a secure connection to your virtual network from an individual client computer. Question 4. Your company has two on-premises servers named SRV01 and SRV02. Developers have created an application that runs on SRV01. The application calls a service on SRV02 by IP address. You plan to migrate the application on Azure virtual machine. You have configured two virtual machines on a single subnet in an Azure virtual network. You need to configure the two virtual machines with the static internal IP addresses. What should you do? The correct answer is E. Run the set-azure static VNet IP PowerShell cmdlet. Specify a static internal IP for a previously created virtual machine. If you want to set a static IP address for a virtual machine that you previously created, you can do so by using the following cmdlets. If you already set an IP address for the virtual machine and you want to change it to a different IP address, you shall need to remove the existing static IP address before running these cmdlets. See the instructions below to remove a static IP. For this procedure, you shall use the update-azure VM cmdlet. The update-azure VM cmdlet restarts the virtual machine as part of the update process. The DIP that you specify will be assigned after the virtual machine restarts. In this example, we set the IP address for virtual machine 2, which is located in Cloud Service Static Demo. Question 5. Your company has a Microsoft Azure subscription. The company has data centers in Los Angeles and New York. You are configuring the two data centers as geo-clustered sites for site resiliency. You need to recommend an Azure storage redundancy option. You have the following data storage requirements. Data must be stored on multiple nodes. Data must be stored on nodes in separate geographic locations. Data can be read from the secondary location as well as from the primary location. Which of the following Azure stored redundancy options should you recommend? Our options are A. Geo-redundant storage, B. Read-only geo-redundant storage, C. Zone redundant storage, or D. Locally redundant storage. The correct option here is B. Read-only geo-redundant storage. RAGRS allows you to have higher read availability for your storage account by providing read-only access to the data replicated to the secondary location. Once you enable this feature, the secondary location may be used to achieve higher availability in the event the data is not available in the primary region. This is an opt-in feature which requires the storage account to be geo-replicated. Question 6. Your company has an Azure subscription. You need to deploy a number of Azure virtual machines using Azure Resource Manager templates. You have been informed that the virtual machines will be included in a single availability set. You are required to make sure that the ARM template you configure allows for as many virtual machines as possible to remain accessible in the event of fabric failure or maintenance. Which of the following is the value that you should configure for the platform fault domain count property? Our options are A. 10, B. 30, C. Min value, or D. Max value. The correct option is D. Max value. The number of fault domains for managed availability sets varies by region, either 2 or 3 per region. Question 7. Your company has several departments. Each department has a number of virtual machines. The company has an Azure subscription that contains a resource group named RG1. All virtual machines are located in RG1. You want to associate each virtual machine with its respective department. What should you do? Our options are A. Create Azure management groups for each department. B. Create a resource group for each department. C. Assign tags to the virtual machine. Or D. Modify the settings of the virtual machines. The correct option here is C. Assign tags to the virtual machine. These tags are what associate the virtual machines to each department. Then, for example, it can be charged to each department. Question 8. Your company has 3 virtual machines that are included in an availability set. You try to resize one of the virtual machines, which returns an allocation failure message. It is imperative that the virtual machine is resized. Which of the following actions should you take? Our options are A. You should only stop one of the virtual machines. B. You should stop 2 of the virtual machines. C. You should stop all 3 virtual machines. Or D. You should remove the necessary virtual machine from the availability set. The correct answer is C. You should stop all 3 virtual machines. If the virtual machine you wish to resize is part of an availability set, then you must stop all virtual machines in the availability set before changing the size of any virtual machine in the availability set. The reason all virtual machines in the availability set must be stopped before performing the resize operation to a size that requires different hardware is that all running virtual machines in the availability set must be using the same physical hardware cluster. Therefore, if a change of a physical hardware cluster is required to change the virtual machine size, then all virtual machines must be first stopped and then restarted one by one to a different physical hardware cluster. Question 9. You administer a solution in Azure that is currently having performance issues. You need to find the cause of the performance issues pertaining to metrics on the Azure infrastructure. Which of the following is the tool you should use? Our options are A. Azure Traffic Analytics, B. Azure Monitor, C. Azure Activity Log, or D. Azure Advisor. The correct option is B. Azure Monitor. Metrics in Azure Monitor are stored in a time series database which is optimized for analyzing timestamp data This makes metrics particularly suited for alerting and fast detection of issues. Question 10. Your company has an Azure subscription that includes a recovery service vault. You want to use Azure Backup to schedule a backup of your company's virtual machines to the recovery services vault. Which of the following virtual machines can you backup? Choose all that apply. Our options are A. Virtual machines that run Windows 10. B. Virtual machines that run Windows Server 2012 or higher. C. Virtual machines that have not been shut down. D. Virtual machines that run Debian 8.2 plus. Or E. Virtual machines that have been shut down. In this particular question, all the options are correct. We can backup all of these services to the recovery service vault. Azure Backup supports all of these options: 64-bit Windows Server operating system for Windows Server 2008, 64-bit Windows 10 operating system, 64-bit Debian operating system from Debian 7.9 plus, and all the virtual machines that are shut down or offline. Question 11. You have the Azure virtual machines shown in the following table. You have a recovery services vault that protects VM1 and VM2. You need to protect VM3 and VM4 by using recovery services. What should you do first? Our options are A. Create a new recovery services vault. B. Create a storage account. C. Configure the extensions for VM3 and VM4. Or D. Create a new backup policy. The correct option is A. Create a new recovery services vault. A recovery services vault is a storage entity in Azure that houses data. The data is typically copies of data or configuration information for virtual machines, workloads, servers, or workstations. You can use recovery services vaults to hold backup data for various Azure services. Question 12. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure AD tenant named Conditional.com and an Azure Kubernetes service cluster named AKS1. An administrator reports that she is unable to grant access to AKS1 to the users in contours.com. You need to ensure that access to AKS1 can be granted to the contours.com users. What should you do first? Our options are A. From contours.com, modify the organization relationship settings. B. From contours.com, create an OAuth 2.0 authorization endpoint. C. Recreate AKS1. Or D. From AKS1, create a namespace. The correct option is B. From contours.com, create an OAuth 2.0 authorization endpoint. Cluster administrators can configure Kubernetes role-based access control based on a user's identity or directory group membership. Azure AD authentication is provided to AKS clusters with OpenID Connect. OpenID Connect is an identity layer built on top of the OAuth 2.0 protocol. Question 13. Your company's Azure subscription includes Azure virtual machines that run Windows Server 2016. One of the virtual machines is backed up every day using Azure Backup Instant Restore. When the virtual machine becomes infected with data encrypting ransomware, you are required to restore the virtual machine. Which of the following actions should you take? Our options are A. You should restore the virtual machine after deleting the infected virtual machine. B. You should restore the virtual machine to any virtual machine within the company subscription. C. You should restore the virtual machine to a new Azure virtual machine. Or D. You should restore the VM to an on-premise Windows device. The correct option here is C. You should restore the VM to a new Azure virtual machine. About the options: A. If you delete the virtual machine, you cannot recover it. About B. You do not know the other virtual machines. About C. By creating a new virtual machine, you can recover the older one. And about D. You can recover it from the backup. Question 14. You have an Azure subscription named AZ-104 that contains the resources shown in the following table. You create a new Azure subscription named AZ-104. You need to identify which resources can be moved to AZ-104. Which resources should you identify? Our options are A. VM1, Storage 1, VNet 1, and VM1 managed only. B. VM1 and VM1 managed only. C. VM1, storage 1, VNet 1, VM1 managed and R Vault 1. Or D. R Vault 1 only. The correct option here is C. VM1, storage 1, VNet 1, VM1 managed and R Vault 1. You can move a virtual machine and its associated resources to a different subscription by using the Azure portal. You can now move an Azure Recovery Service Vault to either a new resource group within the current subscription or to a new subscription. Question 15. You have an Azure AD tenant that contains 5000 user accounts. You create a new user account named admin user 1. You need to assign the user administrative role to admin user 1. What should you do from the user account properties? Our options are A. From the licenses blade, assign a new license. B. From the directory role blade, modify the directory role. Or C. From the groups blade, invite the user account to a new group. The correct option here is B. From the directory role blade, modify the directory role. Assigning a role to a user. First, sign into the Azure portal with an account that's a global admin or privileged role admin for the directory. Secondly, select Azure Active Directory, select users, and then select a specific user from the list. Third, for the selected user, select Add Role, and then pick the appropriate admin roles from the directory roles list, such as Conditional Access Administrator. And lastly, press Select to save. Question 16. You have an Azure AD tenant named contoso.onmicrosoft.com that contains 100 user accounts. You purchase 10 Azure AD Premium P2 licenses for the tenant. You need to ensure that 10 users can use all the Azure AD Premium features. What should you do? Our options are A. From the licenses blade of Azure AD, assign a license. B. From the groups blade of each user, invite the users to a group. C. From the Azure AD domain, add an enterprise application. Or D. From the directory role blade of each user, modify the directory role. The correct option is A. From the licenses blade of Azure AD, assign a license. Firstly is Active Directory, then Manage Selection, then Choose Licenses, then All Products, then select Azure AD Premium P2, and then assign a user to it. Question 17. Drag drop. You have downloaded an Azure Resource Manager template to deploy numerous virtual machines. The ARM template is based on current virtual machine, but must be adapted to reference an administrative password. You need to make sure that the password cannot be stored in plain text. You are preparing to create the necessary components to achieve your goal. Which of the following should you create to achieve your goal? Answer by dragging the correct option from the list to the answer area. Select and place. The options provided to us are an Azure Key Vault, an Azure Storage Account, Azure AD Identity Protection, an Access Policy, an Azure Policy, a Backup Policy. From among all these, the correct options are an Azure Key Vault and an Access Policy. You can use a template that allows you to deploy a simple Windows virtual machine by retrieving the password that is stored in a key vault. Therefore, the password is never put in plain text in the template parameter file. Question 18. Your company has an Azure AD tenant that is configured for hybrid coexistence with the on-premises Active Directory domain. You plan to deploy several new virtual machines in Azure. The virtual machines will have the same operating system and custom software requirements. You configure a reference virtual machine in the on-premise virtual environment. You then generalize the virtual machine to create an image. You need to upload the image to Azure to ensure that it is available for selection when you create the new Azure virtual machine. When you create the new Azure virtual machine, which PowerShell cmdlets should you use? Our options are A. Add-AZ VM, B. Add-AZ VHD, C. Add-AZ image, or D. Add-AZ image data disk. The correct option is B. add-azvhd. The add-azvhd cmdlet uploads on-premises virtual hard disks in .vhd file format to a blob storage account as fixed virtual hard disks. Question 19. Your company has an Azure AD tenant that is configured for hybrid coexistence with the on-premises Active Directory domain. The on-premise virtual environment consists of virtual machines running on Windows Server 2012 R2 Hyper-V host servers. You have created some PowerShell scripts to automate the configuration of newly created virtual machines. You plan to create several new virtual machines. You need a solution that ensures the scripts are run on the new virtual machines. Which of the following is the best solution? The correct option is A. Configure a setupcomplete.cmd batch file in the %windir %setup/scripts directory. After you deploy a virtual machine, you typically need to make some changes before it is ready to use. This is something you can do manually, or you could use remote PowerShell to automate the configuration of your virtual machine after deployment, for example. But now, there is a third alternative available, allowing you to customize the virtual machine, the custom script extension. This custom script extension is executed by the virtual machine agent, and it is very straightforward. You specify which files it needs to download from your storage account and which file it needs to execute. You can even specify arguments that need to be passed to the script. The only requirement is that you execute a .ps1 file. Question 20. Your company has an Azure Active Directory subscription. You need to deploy 5 virtual machines to your company's virtual network subnet. The VMs will each have both a public and private IP address. Inbound and outbound security rules for all of these virtual machines must be identical. Which of the following is the least amount of network interfaces needed for this configuration? Our options are A5, B10, C20, or D40. The correct option is A5. So, 5 NIC cards. We have the public and private IP addresses set to them. However, they need same inbound and outbound rule, so create NSG and attach to NIC, and this requirement can be fulfilled by 5 NIC. Hence, 5 is the right answer. Question 21. Your company has an Azure Active Directory subscription. You need to deploy 5 virtual machines to your company's virtual network subnet. The VMs will each have both a public and private IP address. Inbound and outbound security rules for all of these virtual machines must be identical. Which of the following is the least amount of security groups needed for this configuration? Our options are A4, B3, C2, or D1. The correct option is D1. You will only require one security group as all the settings are the same. Question 22. Your company's Azure subscription includes Azure virtual machines that run Windows Server 2016. One of the virtual machine is backed up every day using Azure Backup Instant Restore. When the virtual machine becomes infected with data encrypting ransomware, you decide to recover the virtual machine's files. Which of the following is true in this scenario? Our options are A. You can only recover the files to the infected virtual machine. B. You can recover the files to any virtual machine within the company subscription. C. You can only recover the files to a new virtual machine. Or D. You will not be able to recover the files. The correct option is B. You can recover the files to any virtual machine within the company subscription. You can restore files by mounting the backup to your own local machine if you like, just like you could on any of the virtual machines in Azure, as they are all 2016. It just uses an ISCI connection to the backup image. You cannot restore files to an older or newer version of the OS. It must be a compatible client OS. Therefore, restoring files back to the same subscription is the best option, but it has to be the same OS version. Although answer A is possible, but restoring files back to an infected virtual machine doesn't sound right to me. Question 23. You have an Azure AD tenant named contosocloud.onmicrosoft.com. Your company has a public DNS zone for contoso.com. You add contoso.com as a custom domain name to Azure AD. You need to ensure that Azure can verify the domain name. Which type of DNS record should you create? Our options are A. MX, B. NSEC, C. PTR, or D. RRSIG. The correct option is A. MX. To verify your custom domain name, first sign into the Azure portal using a global administrator account for the directory. Secondly, select Azure Active Directory and then select Custom Domain Names. Thirdly, on the Fabricam Custom Domain Names page, select the custom domain name Contoso. And at last, on the Contoso page, select Verify to make sure your custom domain is properly registered and is valid for Azure AD. Use either the TXT or the MX record type. Note, there are several versions of this question in the exam. The question can have two correct answers. First is MX and second is TXT. The question can also have other incorrect answer options including the following: SRV and NSEC3. Question 24. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1 that contains a virtual network named VNet1. VNet1 is in a resource group named RG1. Subscription 1 has a user named User1. User1 has the following roles: Reader, Security Admin, Security Reader. You need to ensure that User1 can assign the reader role for VNet1 to other users. What should you do? The correct option is B. Assign User1 the User Access Administrator role for VNet1. He will have full access to all resources, including the right to delegate access to others. Note, there are several versions of this question in the exam. The question has two possible correct answers. First is assign User1 the User Access Administrator role for VNet1. The second is assign User1 the owner role for VNet1. Question 25. Drag drop. Your company has an Azure subscription that includes a number of Azure virtual machines which are all part of the same virtual network. Your company also has an on-premises Hyper-V server that hosts a virtual machine named VM1, which must be replicated to Azure. Which of the following objects that must be created to achieve this goal? Answer by dragging the correct option from the list to the answer area. Select and place. The options provided to us are Hyper-V site, storage account, Azure Recovery Services Vault, Azure Traffic Manager instance, replication policy, and endpoint. Among all these options, the correct options are Hyper-V site, Azure Recovery Services Vault, and replication policy. Question 26. You have a Microsoft 365 tenant and an Azure AD tenant named contoso.com. You plan to grant 3 users named User1, User2, and User3 access to a temporary Microsoft SharePoint document library named Library1. You need to create groups for the users. The solution must ensure that the groups are deleted automatically after 180 days. Which 2 groups should you create? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. The correct options are A and C, that is a Microsoft 365 group that uses the assigned membership type, and a Microsoft 365 group that uses the dynamic user membership type. You can set expiration policy only for Office 365 groups in Azure AD. Note, with the increase in usage of Office 365 groups, administrator and users need a way to clean up unused groups. Expiration policies can help remove inactive groups from the system and make things cleaner. When a group expires, all of its associated services are also deleted. You can set up a rule for dynamic membership on security groups or Office 365 groups. Question 27. Hotspot. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1 that contains a resource group named RG1. In RG1, you create an internal load balancer named LB1 and a public load balancer named LB2. You need to ensure that an administrator named Admin1 can manage LB1 and LB2. The solution must follow the principle of least privilege. Which role should you assign to admin 1 for each task? To answer, select the appropriate option in the answer area. Note, each correct answer is worth 1 point. To the answer area, to add a backend pool to LB1. Our options are contributor on LB1, network contributor on LB1, network contributor on RG1, or owner on LB1. The correct option is network contributor on RG1. To the next statement, to add a health probe to LB2. Our options are contributor on LB2, network contributor on LB2, network contributor on RG1, or owner on LB2. The correct option here is again network contributor on RG1. Question 28. You sign up for Azure AD Premium P2. You need to add a user named email protected as an administrator on all the computers that will be joined to the Azure AD domain. What should you configure in Azure AD? Our options are A. Device settings from the devices blade, B. Providers from the MFA server blade, C. User settings from the users blade, or D. General settings from the groups blade. The correct option is A. Device settings from the devices blade. When you connect a Windows device with Azure AD using an Azure AD join, Azure AD adds the following security principles to the local administrators group on the device: the Azure AD Global Administrator role, the Azure AD Device Administrator role, and the user performing the Azure AD join. In the Azure portal, you can manage the Device Administrator role on the Devices page. To open the Devices page, first sign in to your Azure portal as a Global Administrator or Device Administrator. Second, on the left nav bar, click Azure AD. Third, in the Manage selection, click Devices. Fourth, on the Devices page, click Device Settings. And lastly, to modify the Device Administrator role, configure additional local administrators on Azure AD join devices. Question 29. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1 and an on-premises deployment of Microsoft System Center Service Manager. Subscription 1 contains a virtual machine named VM1. You need to ensure that an alert is set in Service Manager when the amount of available memory on VM1 is below 10%. What should you do first? Our options are A. Create an automation runbook, B. Deploy a function app, C. Deploy the IT Service Management Connector, or D. Create a notification. The correct option is C. Deploy the IT Service Management Connector. The IT Service Management Connector allows you to connect Azure and a supported IT Service Management product or service such as the Microsoft System Center Service Manager. With ITSM, you can create work items in ITSM tool based on your Azure alerts. It is to be noted that the questions from 30 to 40 are a part of a series of multiple questions that present the same scenario. Each question in the series contains a unique solution that might meet the stated goals. Some question sets might have more than one correct solution, while others might not have a correct solution. After you answer a question in this section, you will not be able to return to it. As a result, these questions will not appear in the review screen. Question 30. Your company has an Azure subscription that includes a storage account, a resource group, a blob container, and a file share. A colleague named John Ross makes use of a solitary Azure Resource Manager template to deploy a virtual machine and an additional Azure storage account. You want to review the ARM template that was used by John Ross. Solution. You access the resource group blade. Does the solution meet the goal? The correct answer is A. Yes. Question 31. Your company has an Azure subscription that includes a storage account, a resource group, a blob container, and a file share. A colleague named John Ross makes use of a solitary Azure Resource Manager template to deploy a virtual machine and an additional Azure storage account. You want to review the ARM template that was used by John Ross. Solution. You access the container blade. Does the solution meet the goal? The correct answer is B. No. You should use the resource group blade. Question 32. Your company has an Azure AD subscription. You want to implement an Azure AD conditional access policy. The policy must be configured to require members of the global administrators group to use multi-factor authentication and an Azure AD join devices when they connect to Azure AD from untrusted locations. Solution. You access the Azure portal to alter the session control of the Azure AD conditional access policy. Does the solution meet the goal? The correct answer is B. No. No, you have to alter the grant control, not session control. Question 33. Your company has an Azure Active Directory subscription. You have to implement an Azure AD conditional access policy. The policy must be configured to require members of the global administrators group to use multi-factor authentication and an Azure AD join device when they connect to Azure AD from untrusted locations. Solution. You access the Azure portal to alter the grant control of the Azure AD conditional access policy. Does the solution meet the goal? If you have paid attention to the last question, then you will know that the correct answer is A. Yes. There is another copy of this question that mentions going to the MFA page in Azure portal as a solution. That is incorrect. On that page, you cannot make a conditional access policy. The answer A is correct. Instead of the MFA page mentioned above, you have to go to the root of conditional access policy, grant control mentioned here for this question. Under grant control, you are given the option of setting MFA and requiring AD join devices in the exact same window. Question 34. Your company has an Azure AD subscription. You want to implement an Azure AD conditional access policy. The policy must be configured to require members of the global administrators group to use multi-factor authentication and an Azure AD join device when they connect to Azure AD from untrusted locations. Solution. You access the multi-factor authentication page to alter the user settings. Does the solution meet the goal? This is the version that was discussed in the last question. The correct answer to this is B. No. The best way to enforce MFA is by conditional access. The device has to be identified by Azure AD as an AD join device. The trusted IP must be configured. Question 35. Your company has a Microsoft SQL Server always on availability group configured on their Azure virtual machines. You need to configure an Azure internal load balancer as a listener for the availability group. Solution. You create an HTTP health probe on port 1433. Does the solution meet the goal? The correct answer is B. No. A HTTP health probe on port 1433 sounds ugly. Assume no. Question 36. Your company has a Microsoft SQL Server always on availability group configured on their Azure virtual machines. You need to configure an Azure internal load balancer as a listener for the availability group. Solution. You set session persistence to client IP. Does the solution meet the goal? The correct answer is B. No. Session persistence ensures that a client will remain connected to the same server throughout a session or period of time. Because load balancing may, by default, send users to unique servers each time they connect. This can mean that complicated or repeated requests are slowed down. Question 37. Your company has a Microsoft SQL Server always on availability group configured on their Azure virtual machines. You need to configure an Azure internal load balancer as a listener for the availability group. Solution. You enable floating IP. Does the solution meet the goal? The correct answer here is A. Yes. The load balancing rules configure how the load balancer routes traffic to the SQL Server instance. For this load balancer, you enable direct server return because only one of the two SQL Server instances owns the availability group listener resource at a time. Floating IP is enabled. Question 38. You have an Azure AD tenant named contoso.com. You have a CSV file that contains the names and email addresses of 500 external users. You need to create a guest user account in contoso.com for each of the 500 external users. Solution. You create a PowerShell script that runs the new -Azure AD user cmdlet for each user. Does this meet the goal? The correct answer is B. No. The new dash Azure AD user cmdlet creates a user in Azure AD. Instead, use the new dash Azure AD MS invitation cmdlet, which is used to invite a new external user to your directory. Question 39. You have an Azure AD tenant named contoso.com. You have a CSV file that contains the names and email addresses of 500 external users. You need to create a guest user account in contoso.com for each of the 500 external users. Solution. From Azure AD in the Azure portal, you use the bulk create user operation. Does this meet the goal? The correct answer is B. No. Bulk create is for new Azure AD users. For guests, use bulk invite users to prepare a comma separated value file with the user information and invitation preferences. Upload the .csv file to Azure AD. Verify that the users were added to the directory. Question 40. You have an Azure AD tenant named contoso.com. You have a CSV file that contains the names and email addresses of 500 external users. You need to create a guest user account in contoso.com for each of the 500 external users. Solution. You create a PowerShell script that runs the new dash Azure AD MS invitation cmdlet for each external user. Does this meet the goal? The correct answer is A. Yes. This cmdlet is used to invite a new external user to your directory.